Hello and welcome to another thrilling episode of the St. Balasar University English Club podcast. My name's Joshua.
And I am Andrew.
And today we've adopted our actual identities. We've shunted Norman and William, Vad Devrel and Runix, and Lanny Sarab and all the rest right out the door. This is English Club After Dark.
The extended universe, you might say.
We're going to dig down deep. We're going to be honest. We're going to be raw and real.
Yeah, so the reason I wanted to talk to you today is because I've always wanted to be an English major. I think that if I could go back and change something about my life, I would have studied English. And now this isn't our like St. Balasar University bit, right? Like you are literally, your undergraduate degree was in English creative writing. Is that correct?
Yes, and also German studies.
Also German studies, which is really funny because that kind of factors into how we ended up meeting.
We'll get there.
Yeah, let's flash back. You are a young little guy just getting started out in the world. Maybe you're in high school. Maybe you're starting to take some AP dual credit courses. What made you say, all right, I'm going to study English creative writing as a subject?
So I think I first learned of English as like a major in creative writing in particular, as like a degree in around like 7th grade or so.
Really? That's young.
Yeah, it was pretty early on. That was when I first heard about the Iowa Writers Workshop. I remember that was the context in which I learned about a creative writing degree existing. I had always liked to read as a kid, which is not a particularly interesting or unique story, especially not among people who go on to be English majors. And since I was really little, I had been drawing like comic books that were essentially like fan fiction.
Mhm.
So I had this character. I drew these comic books of Pikmin characters. I had this OC Super Pikmin who was like a combination of all the different Pikmin types. So he had like the nose of the red Pikmin and the ears of the yellow Pikmin, and he was strong like the purple Pikmin, and he was bomb proof because there's bombs in Pikmin for some reason.
He was like the Avatar.
Yeah, he was. So anyway, around like middle school or so, I started to realize that my drawing skills were never going to get good enough to like turn into anything. But I felt like maybe writing was something I could manage.
Mm-hmm.
So I couldn't type. So I taught myself to type using like some weird sketchy website that was just like type out increasingly complex combinations of letters. And then I started writing these little short stories. These were not fan fiction. These were just stories that I was making up.
Mm-hmm.
The only one that I can remember really clearly off the top of my head was this story called like The Cells or something like that.
Okay.
And the story was very rambling. It kind of didn't have anything in it, like no real plot or substance. The main character was like a guy. He had like a male and a female love interest.
Ooh, wow.
And
Very...
they fought a robot spider.
Your bi icon.
And yeah, for real. It was a prophecy of things to come. By definition of prophecies, that which has been foretold. Anyway, so I was writing these stories, that one probably being the most interesting one. And I don't remember who it was. It might have been a teacher or it might have been a family friend who was like, oh, did you know that there's like these newfangled creative writing degrees nowadays? And of course, like this was a person, whoever they were, they must not have been very familiar with like the fact that creative writing workshops had existed since like the 50s. And they were like, oh yeah, you could go to this place called Iowa and get a creative writing degree. And I don't even think they knew that Iowa, the Writers Workshop, is like primarily a master's program, because they were talking about it like it was a thing you could go to college and do. And Iowa does have an undergrad creative writing degree, I believe, but it's not the Iowa Writers Workshop.
Mm-hmm.
So from then on, I just kind of kept writing my stories. In high school, I started working on a novel. Then I scrapped that idea and started working on a second novel, which you have read.
I have. It's a good novel.
Yeah, well, it's a novel. It's a complete story, unlike the giant spider bisexual post-apocalypse one. And
better.
Yeah, I got to St. Balasar University, and I picked my majors, and I was off to the English races.
St. Balasar University is kind of our local school, but was there anything else that kind of drew you to it about the English major in specific?
Yeah. So the English program at St. Balasar University was more established than the other school, the rival school that I was primarily considering.
Mm-hmm.
It was a coincidence that the year that I was being admitted, the other school, which is actually better known for its humanities programs, including a notable German program, was sort of restructuring its whole undergraduate creative writing deal. And I was kind of like, I don't know if I want to be a guinea pig for this. So I stuck with the St. Balasar University affiliation. Also, the German professor. So I met with German professors at both institutions before I made my final decision, and the one at the rival school was like, she was not very nice to me.
Oh no.
She was very curt, and she made it sound as though she did not have time for me. It was, and then the one at St. Balasar University was so welcoming and warm, and little things like that.
St. Balasar University has an awful German program. She was so mean to me.
You can't say that on the podcast.
Joshua, before I ask you my next question, I am going to crawl up on my little soapbox for a second. You know how I like to do that.
Yep.
I have worked in very, very big companies, software companies, multinational banks. I have worked with and for English majors. I've known very financially successful English majors. I've known lawyers, technical writers, you name it. So I want to clarify that I am not being condescending when I'm asking you, what were you thinking would happen 4 years down the line when you graduated with your English degree?
When I started out, I had that naive dream that I think a lot of English majors have, especially English creative writing majors, have, that like by chance they will be the one, capital T, capital O, that makes it. Capital M, capital I.
Yeah. We can all relate to that, I think.
Other than that, career pathways for humanities majors and especially English majors are extremely fuzzy. It's not a secret or necessarily particularly surprising or interesting to say that, unlike an engineering or a chemistry or a biology degree, the English degree, it leaves you open to potentially go a lot of different places, and that can be daunting. And so I was kind of hanging my hat on this hope that, like, the novel I was working on at the time would be the next big YA novel, and I could coast on that for the rest of my career.
But I do want to say for the viewers at home, and maybe I'm speaking from kind of an uninformed place since I'd studied business at St. Balasar University, but I've known a lot of successful English majors. And Joshua, maybe this will come up in a sequel, but you have found gainful employment for your writing skills. Like, it is not the nail in the coffin that people frame it to be. And that's something that I tend to get really passionate about, because learning to be a communicator, learning to understand how people convey information to each other is not an unvaluable skill.
No, there's definitely things you can do with it, and things that are literally writing that you can do with it. I actually turned down what probably would have been a fairly profitable starting job in order to attend grad school, but we'll talk about that in a future episode.
So you're in this program, you are in this whole new world, a new environment, and you are here to study creative writing. What were your first impressions of the program here at St. Balasar University?
Man, so it's hard to put myself back in that headspace because my life was so fundamentally different back then. I was just a really different person.
And that's worth noting, is that you change over the course of your university career.
It is a thing that happens, and I remember being sort of surprised that my first creative writing workshop, which was in fiction, was taught not by some big name professor, but by a grad student.
Some guy.
It was some lady. She was very talented. She had worked at a legal team for some notable company, and then come back to grad school. And I don't remember if she had been published, but she had won some kind of award that, had put her on the map in some small way.
Sure.
And she was a very good teacher, very firm, and very encouraging at the same time, I think.
So she was just realistic with you.
Yeah, I think realistic is a good way of putting it. I mean, she had business experience outside of creative writing, but her passion was in creative writing. So that's a good example to have, I think, as a starting writer. Someone that's found a way to monetize their skills and also separate their art from their employment,
Right.
their means of existence.
So you had your introduction courses. What else was kind of in the periphery? What other classes were you taking?
I was taking a few German classes, a few random other humanities classes that I wasn't in love with. This was something that I definitely struggled with in undergrad, was giving a shit about classes I didn't give a shit about. My grades were really good, but looking back, I didn't realize how much I was struggling to put effort into classes that simply didn't interest me. And I was sort of bad at prioritizing, I think. I was good enough at prioritizing to succeed, but bad at prioritizing in the sense that like I was putting every class at like a 7 or an 8 when really I could have put my English classes at like a 10, and then like some of my linguistics classes like it maybe a 3, and then my socializing like somewhere in the middle so that I had more time to like get out there and have fun. When I look back, I think that the reason I didn't have more fun in undergrad was by my own choice. It wasn't because I was some dorky English major locked up in the library. It was because I chose to be some dorky English major that stayed in his dorm and did every piece of homework that was assigned.
I see. You were just too much of an overachiever.
Not even, though. I mean, I wasn't even doing anything particularly special. I was just doing everything that was assigned to me. I wasn't thinking critically enough about my own personal priorities and goals,
Mhm.
as opposed to the learning objectives laid out by the university.
So, what specific books did they have you read for your degree?
So this would vary a lot student to student at St. Balthasar University because there were a lot of different kinds of English electives. I have not taken a single Shakespeare class my entire university career, undergrad or graduate school.
What?
I just haven't.
That's so surprising to me.
Yeah, I intentionally have avoided it because Shakespeare doesn't really interest me, never really interested me, and isn't interesting or relevant now to my like poetic pursuits. And so I'd rather invest my time in things that are more contemporary and more in conversation with my work. But in undergrad, I didn't take Shakespeare more out of a sense of like, oh, fuck the literary tradition, I can do whatever I want. It was a very sort of pathetic kind of rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
But as for what I actually did read, I took an African literature course where we read some interesting classics in like the African literary genre, like Nahanda, which is a story about colonization from the perspective of like sort of a collective entity. It's from the perspective of a real historical figure, Nahanda, who's like a mystic, but it's also her consciousness is like also the consciousness of like her community a little bit, and so it's very avant-garde, very interesting, super super different from like a lot of Western literature. Because I was in the German program, I also read a lot of stuff in German. So I read Faust in German,
Mm-hmm.
read a lot of Kafka, of course,
Yes.
my dearest beloved Kafka. And I took a really cool young adult literature course early on too, which was in my mind, the first step towards becoming that next big young adult author. So in that
Absolutely.
class, which I thought it was great that they offered that because it took things like the Hunger Games
Mm-hmm.
and it treated them. And I don't even personally really like the Hunger Games. But it took it and it treated it seriously. It was like, look how symbolism
Mm-hmm.
is operating in this book, just as it operates in, say, Lord of the Flies or A Separate Peace, which were also books that we read in that class. And then I ultimately did my final paper in that class on Ursula K. Le Guin's first Earthsea book, which is also a book that I don't particularly enjoy, but it's a young adult book, and the fact that we treated it like a serious piece of art and not just like a little kiddie thing for children, I thought was very progressive in a way that I wasn't expecting to find in a university setting.
That's so cool. I love how your YA class like just took the work seriously. I think that's something that we've come to stand for here at the English Club.
It is, and I think that influenced me a bit because I do think that when people put serious effort into writing or creating a thing, they deserve the respect of having serious analysis put onto it by others.
Absolutely. And it just makes for a more constructive experience overall.
Yeah, I mean, and here at the podcast, we like to rib on these famously bad books a little bit, but I think it comes from a place of love and respect, unless it's Ben Shapiro's book, in which case we don't owe him shit. But but a good faith book like an Empress Teresa,
Mhm.
that deserves to be, I don't know. It's a book you leave the gloves on for a little bit.
Because I mean, looking at your kind of biography, you were thinking of being the next big thing, the newest. You don't have to worry about anything that preceded you. You are your own thing, and that is a sentiment that you see a lot in Norman Bouton's forum posts, for instance. If you remember that video, how he's like, "Oh, I don't care about these other YA books that I'm trying to emulate because I don't know, I'm just divinely inspired in a way that no one else is." We do, through these experiences, come to sympathize a lot with the authors that we do rib on in this podcast, but otherwise that we understand them.
I will say though, I think that maybe one of the weaknesses of the St. Balthasar University English department
Mm-hmm.
was that I graduated maybe not as well read in sort of like the foundational or maybe canonical Western literary texts.
Mm-hmm.
And that has come back to bite me a bit. But because I was able to avoid Shakespeare and avoid Chaucer and avoid, I don't even know what else, I maybe missed out on some things that would be good to know. Like, I read the Odyssey, the Iliad on my own time, just because I felt like they were things you're supposed to read. This was also a thing that happened to me in high school. I skipped a grade of English, and so I never read like Hamlet, and I never read The Crucible, which is another thing they read in that year. I ended
Oh,
up reading
wow.
The Great Gatsby like on my own time because I was like, I probably should have read this by now.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this is just a thing that happens if you're a writer, is you feel like there's too much to read and you're always playing catch up. And now that I've added poetry, or sort of made poetry my main pursuit, I feel like I'm even further behind because there's all these novels, important novels that you're supposed to read, but as a poet there's all these important poets that you're supposed to read too.
So you never win, and you really just kind of have to piece things together on your own time, no matter what the curriculum tells you to read, right?
Yeah, I would say that's true. I think if I had read all the classics, then I probably would have graduated thinking like, oh, why have I never read any Murakami or something like that.
So Joshua, what extracurriculars did you get into?
Well, Andrew, it was purely by happenstance that I fell into this sort of funky situation with this little organization called the English Club. Perhaps you've heard of it.
Yeah, so for context, guys, this is a true story. Joshua and I did meet in real life university, and we were in a real life English club where we did creative writing critique. I'm a year ahead of Joshua because when he was first starting, it was like my sophomore year. I was a business major. I was miserable. I didn't have anything to do with my time. So I was a writer and I wanted to be more involved and kind of, I don't even know, I wanted to be an English major without being an English major. So I started coming to English club meetings and nobody liked me. And then I kind of orchestrated this hostile takeover. So by the time my sophomore year came around, I was like the president. So I was like aggressively tabling, trying to get new people for this vision that I had of a creative writing critique group where aspiring writers from all walks of life at the university can meet up and exchange their work. And I think that's where my paths cross with Joshua.
If it's okay with you, Andrew, before we get to that story, I think I've heard this from you in different pieces over the years, but I'd like to hear more about what the English Club was like in that freshman year of yours before I entered the picture. Because
Yeah.
I think the contrast between what it was then and what you made it into is like pretty interesting context.
So I can go ahead and tell you that it was nothing. Like the president before me would sit at the front of the classroom and be like, "Okay, guys, what do you want to do today?" Maybe sometimes we'd watch a movie, but like honestly, there really wasn't too much going on. But every now and then, there would be a critique group where you sent in writing, the people read it on their own time before the club meeting, and then you sat together and you just talked through it. And it was kind of like an intro to creative writing classroom, but it was a little bit more freeform. Obviously, there's no teacher, so people were a little bit more, I guess you would call it, free spirited in their responses.
Authentic, maybe.
Yeah. And I was like, why isn't this the entire club? And so I made it the entire club That was the selling point for me when I was tabling for the new era under the Andrew administration.
The thing that's so interesting to me about the English club as an entity is that St. Battlestar University actually has like a few of these types of clubs where it's like the club of the department, and the English club was just like directionless apparently for a long time.
They gave me nothing. It was awful.
I just think it's so interesting that like the department would set up these clubs and then just be like, yeah, whatever. And that'll be interesting later too, because eventually the English club got so popular that the department tried to step in and like take back over once there were already people involved.
Yeah, that ain't gonna happen.
And we had to kind of fight them off. But that was after you had already graduated. Yeah, so while Andrew was aggressively tabling, I think this was like during the first week I had moved onto campus, or maybe the second. It was like still you're getting settled kind of phase. And I was having a lot of social anxiety,
Sure.
and I was having trouble figuring out which of these types of like come join our club events were even worth going to. Because, you meet a lot of people at these things, but like the level of authenticity really varies because some people really are just trying to get you to join a thing. And a lot of the things are like not interesting or they're kind of cringe. So when this guy, called me over at the humanities like come join our club type event, you had a typewriter on the desk, if I remember right.
That was my
that
gimmick.
was sort of the set piece.
Yeah. It worked, dude. It worked. I got a lot of emails off of that.
Yeah, so like you had this typewriter set up and it was like, come type your email in if you're interested in joining the English club. And I don't remember if when we met at that point, if you even told me like that it was a creative writing critique group. I didn't even know what the English club was. I'm pretty sure your trifold had like nothing on it except for like the words English club in like paper letters glued to it. And then there was like a typewriter with some like emails like shittily typed out in the paper that was like wilting off the back of it. And then I forget, did I tell you that I was also a German major, or did you?
I saw German upon your breast. You wore.
Oh, right, I had a name tag.
Yeah, you wore a name tag showing your majors. And so for context, I speak German as well. So I started talking to this guy in German and he was just staring at me.
Yeah, so I've been taking German since I was in kindergarten, but I have this sort of I always have this initial nervousness whenever I start talking German with somebody new. And so this guy starts talking to me in German, and in the area that I live in, it's not uncommon for people to either be German or have German parents, and so to speak it fluently. And so there's always this sort of initial like weird like power check, I guess, where someone speaks to you in German and then you speak back. And then there's like a moment of like snap judgment where it's like, oh, this person actually speaks German, or like, they kind of speak German. And in high school, I faced like some pretty rude judgment from people whose parents were German, and so I've always been nervous about speaking German to somebody for the first time.
That's so funny. You got picked on for not speaking German well enough.
I really did. One time I was at Taekwondo, and in the locker room, I don't remember how I learned that this guy's parents were German, but somehow I had learned it. And so in the locker room, I approached this guy and I started talking to him in German, and he turns to me and in English says, "You should have said das there instead of der."
To be fair, that's probably the friendliest German person in the world. At least he was trying to help you.
No, it was mean. It was bullying. It was crushing.
God, that's so bad.
That stuck with me. Incidents like that have stuck with me. So Andrew started speaking to me in German, and then I'm like, oh my god. But I guess I did a good job because you've since said that my German was passable.
Your German's better than mine. Like, I don't have any German family or upbringing. I just happened to take it in high school, so it was just like, oh hey, I know what that language is. Let me see what this guy's like. He looks cool.
No, you did not think I looked cool. You don't have to lie for the pod.
I did.
Well, anyway, you scared me so bad that I almost didn't show up to club the first time. I'm pretty sure I only showed up because there was another person in my dorm that was interested in going as well. That was how I started coming to English Club, and it became a creative writing critique group that's structured really similarly to the English Club podcast, except the authors of the short stories that we were critiquing and sometimes poetry were actually in the room with us.
And that kind of gave you an extra little perspective. I think for me, at least, it was a fun time just seeing how other writers think on the same kind of level as you. Because it's one thing to critique the greats or even the bads, but to see someone who's like comparable to you and pick their brain, I think was a really valuable experience for me.
I also think, and this is sort of it was sort of just a happy accident, that we had a perfect variety of people that were interested in joining the English club. Most of us were YA or litfic writers, so we were writing for slightly different but similar enough audiences. But like the types of people or the styles of writing were varied enough that we could offer each other really solid feedback from a variety of angles, I think. By which I mean, I was writing at the time this like YA fantasy novel with sort of literary undertones. We had a guy in there who was writing like uber high fantasy with very complicated diction
Oh
and long
god.
paragraphs and very little dialogue. Andrew, you were writing more like spec fic that was more overtly literary. We had
Mhm.
a middle grade fantasy writer. We had another novelist who had actually already been published, and it was just like the perfect mix of fiction writers. And it helped that we were all working in mostly in some kind of fantasy, so we
Yeah.
had like enough perspective on each other's work, but also we're different enough in style that we could sort of make up for each other's weaknesses.
A part of it was luck, but I do want to stress for the viewers at home that these people are out there. No matter what situation that you're in, no matter what university that you go to, someone out there wants to be a writer just like you. And to be able to find them and communicate with them and trade chapters with them on the regular is a life-changing experience.
Yeah, you just got to find them. And to credit to you, I don't know how you did it. I know I certainly wouldn't have been able to. But word got around well enough, and eventually we had like a good core group of like 10 to 12 people.
That is another problem. You know, you can get too lucky and then get way too many people, which happened even in my tenure sometimes, but it all evened out in the end. People weed themselves out.
Yeah, and in case people are wondering, the St. Balthasar University English Club is still going strong in my and Andrew's absence. After Andrew left, various members of our sort of core group became president over the remaining semesters, and since then, friends of the final president have become president and occupied other leadership roles. And the English Club is bigger than it was when we were there, which, like Andrew said, is sometimes sort of a problem. They have too many submissions now per week. Really, there's only time for like 3 or 4, and they're getting more than that. But the fact that the English Club has persisted, I think, is proof that there's writers out there that are really looking to collaborate with other writers. And if you're a writer that feels lonely or isolated, know that you don't have to. You just have to do a little bit of looking.
How were the people in your classes? Because I've met some English majors. You're one of the good ones, Joshua. But I've met some English majors. I wouldn't have lunch with them. You know what I mean?
It's a really mixed bag, I would have to say. So it's different the higher up in the fiction workshops that you get, talking, specifically about the actual classes.
Mm-hmm.
So when you start out, there's a healthy mix of people whose major it is, people like me. Then there's people who have a earnest curiosity towards writing fiction and maybe have some experience, maybe have no experience.
People like me.
There's a lot of, yeah, like you. And there's a lot of people who also fall into that category who have like played tabletop games and like want to turn their D&D campaigns into short stories.
Mhm.
Those people are a extremely mixed bag. Sorry if you're a D&D story writer, but like there's I don't know, it doesn't always transfer well. I guess I'll say that.
Yeah.
And then there's people who are, and there were like 4 of these in my first fiction workshop, people who were at St. Balthasar University on athletic scholarships, and they wanted to take an elective that sounded easy. And so we had like so many baseball short stories in my initial workshop class, and it was awful.
Baseball.
It was awful. It was always baseball. I think it's because they were baseball players, but
Still, you can't think of anything else other than baseball playing.
I don't know. These stories were always the exact same thing. It was like I was a baseball player, and then I got an injury, and then my girlfriend and I were having problems, and then at the end I played baseball again, and it was all okay. And it's like not a story. At least it was something. They did the work. They turned it in.
Yeah, they did the work. That's so funny. Sorry to my fiance who might be listening to this, but when I was doing like an intro to creative writing class, I can deal with like the athletic scholarship people. I can deal with like the earnest but kind of weird people. But I was like pretty seriously talking to this girl in my creative writing class, and Then I submitted a short story for critique that like used the word alabaster. She just hated the fact that I used the word alabaster in this short story and ghosted me afterwards. And I can't even be mad because that's so hilarious to me that she did that. So you meet some interesting characters at being an English major.
We also had in my introductory class, we had this woman who was like maybe 40. I don't know if I even want to tell this story. I wish her well. I wish her well. Um, but she wrote the horniest stuff.
Oh God.
She
Oh
wrote
God, I know.
she wrote smut for our classroom full of 18, 19, 20 year olds, which we're all legal adults. It's fine. We know how the sex is, but like somehow being forced to read and critique stories that were both smut and also very thinly veiled autobiographical works that sometimes
No.
contained unnecessarily personal details, like
Autobiographical.
details that I don't know if this will make sense to people who are outside the English averse, but at a high level of creative writing, extremely specific and particular details tend to be, praised as like
Mm-hmm.
inventiveness and creativity and proficiency. But like at a very low level, there's a tendency for people to hear that they need to include extremely specific detail and just put their own life into it and think people won't notice
And
or think that that's what they're
overshare.
supposed to do and essentially overshare. And so, like, it was not hard to tell which things in these stories were just like things that had happened to her or like literal fantasies that she'd had about, say, people in bars. And
No.
it was so uncomfortable. So yeah, you meet some characters, which is maybe a bit ironic in a short story class.
We know this guy, he because in like I don't even know, like old English literature, alliterations were like in vogue at the time. So he's like, I'm gonna write these really primitive sounding stories, these high fantasy, like kind of Tolkien-esque, but in that they're inspired by old English stuff, but not like sword and sorcery per se. Um, but he would just have alliterations everywhere. And one I remember very, very strongly because it was like one of the first English club meetings that I was in. He submitted a story that said, the stream dumped its liquid load.
God, I knew that's where you were going with this story.
The the worst part is that he maintains, and I believe him, that he did not intend that to be in double entendre. Like I totally believe he just was like, liquid. What else starts with L? It just
I mean, it
says,
couldn't possibly have been a double entendre because the story was like so sexless. It was just like a man wandering through the wilderness, like trying to find his horse or something. I don't even remember.
right. I don't remember. I don't remember, but I do remember the phrase liquid load. So people like that are what has informed this podcast, is that we're very used to lightly ribbing on people who write cringe things. Like I feel like, even Norman and Shapiro and all of those guys, Landy Sarum, they're above liquid loads.
And I think what made that guy ultimately like a great critique group member, all of his personal weirdness aside, was that he was able to either like learn why those types of or learn why those types of techniques were no longer used and adapt to the modern day,
Mm-hmm.
or intentionally appeal to tradition. And I say intentionally because it became a choice, where originally it maybe started as like sort of a default thing that he had inherited from books he had read. He started deciding, I'm going to do this here for X or Y reason.
Yeah.
And he was able to to learn to do that, but also learn to like take our jokes and jabs and jab back too at our own works when we did things that were silly. And I think that like the community building of the English club, that aspect of it, the importance of that aspect of it, cannot possibly be understated.
He knew what he was doing, like he knew why he was doing it. The worst part about him, I don't even think he's a bad writer, but like I didn't like his writing, but he was a fantastic critique partner. Like I didn't like the way he wrote, but he would have critiques about my writing. I was like, "Oh my god, that's so true. You're completely correct." So it's just like you got to meet these people. You have to expose yourself to a wide variety of people, and you have to get to know them too. I think a lot of the problem that I see in media criticism or just talking about each other's writing is that there's not enough emphasis placed on the person. And I'm not even talking like in a death of the author sense, the author's vision. If I made the Liquid Load guys' stories the way that I would want to make them, they would be worse because it would run completely contrary to the influences that this guy has, to the things that he wants to be doing with his writing. So it's a very delicate balance you have to strike. So you mentioned writing your little Pikmin bisexual robot spider stories. That was something that was kind of jarring for me coming from an outside perspective into English classes, creative writing critique groups, is how important the short story was. I just quite simply didn't write a lot of short stories until college.
That's a great point because I also didn't know that like short stories were like such a thing before I came to undergrad at St. Balasar University. When you start out, for those who don't know, when you start out in a creative writing workshop class, you're not writing novels. And even my bisexual robot
Hmm.
spider nighttime sleep pod stories were not intended to be short stories. They were intended to be like to build into like a novel or like some kind of, I don't know, picaresque story that's like made up of short
Of
stories.
course, it's picaresque.
Listen, listen. I like the word picaresque, okay? It's a beautiful word, and I think the idea of like interconnected short stories is really compelling. Um, so I came to undergrad and I was like, what's the deal with all these short stories? Um, but the short story is kind of, or like the idea at least is that it's kind of like the ideal testing ground for the principles of fiction, and that
Hmm.
it's its own kind of art form that eventually you can build out into a novel. So in 288, which was the course number, I think, of the first fiction workshop.
Hmm.
Um,
The intro.
yeah, it's called like Introduction to Creative Writing or something like that. You learn how to write short stories, not novels. And some professors, or at that level, like I said, it's grad students teaching, they're really particular about you not bringing in first novel chapters. They're like, we want you to write a self-contained short story in which you can demonstrate the techniques of good fiction writing. So a good balance between dialogue and narration, a strong grasp of point of view, whether it's first, third, or some variant of third person, good imagery, basic stuff that you would expect.
Right. Because all of that is kind of a microcosm of any larger work of narrative fiction, right?
Yeah, it really is. It's like a little, I don't know, a little like microscope slip that
Little
you can,
guy.
yeah, it's a little fella. It's a little fella you can put under a microscope and you can, it's hypothetically, easier to fix things at a small scale, like a short story, than it is to fix things at a big scale, like a novel.
Oh, absolutely. Was that hard for you to transition into that kind of mindset? Because it messed with me for a while.
Yeah, no, it definitely was not easy. I had a hard time learning how to world build for the short story because I had written only novels or things that were intended to grow into novels up until that point. And so I was still writing fantasy. And so I wanted to do like all of this external to the story, like world building that would maybe make its way into the story. And like that's still a really good thing to do as a fiction writer, especially if you're writing any kind of spec, is writing more world building than you're actually going to end up needing to use so that you have it to draw on if
Sure.
necessary. But it was ultimately sort of a hindrance, I think, to my writing because I was doing too much of that and it was sort of a waste of time. So the first short story that I wrote for a St. Balasar University fiction class was this story about the architect who built Charlemagne's Cathedral in Aachen, Germany. This guy, his name is Otto of Metz. He's a real historical guy, and we know nothing about him. So I thought that was such a tragedy because this is a cathedral that I've been to a couple times, and it's a beautiful place. It's one of the few complete remaining buildings that Charlemagne commissioned, and well, like whole buildings. There's some ruins and whatever, but
Sure.
it's beautiful. And this guy is like uncredited. If you read about this cathedral anywhere, it's like, oh, it's Charlemagne's cathedral. Charlemagne built it. It's like, no, he didn't. No, he didn't. He probably didn't pick up a single stone that went into
Right.
that building. Charlemagne didn't do a thing. Um, so I wanted to write this story about this sort of like tragic figure who builds the cathedral and gets no credit. Um, and I won't tell you too much about the story because it's probably not that interesting. But I did all this secondary world building where there was mythology about like the devil being involved and like a pact a pact between Otto
A
of Metz.
Faustian bargain.
Yeah, it was a Faustian bargain where ultimately like it was going to cost Charlemagne's life to build the cathedral. And so I wrote this whole thing and then like it wasn't really that good. And that was sort of a wake up call because then when I went back to edit it for my final portfolio, I had to do all this work and I didn't know where to start because I was like, well, is the problem in the world building? Is it in the character relationships? Is it in character motivation? I don't know. And I have all this material and it's a pain in the ass to try to edit all this stuff
Yeah.
for a 5,000 word story. This is insane.
Well, that's a good point to bring up is the big deep structural problems are no less annoying in a short like story, short fiction environment versus a novel. Like honestly, at least in my experience, maybe I'm weird, but like they're both equally daunting. I don't like doing either.
Yeah, there's a reason I quit writing short stories because the I don't think it's the concision itself, but something about being concise is scary. So novels can be all kinds of lengths, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, what's a good example? So Madeline Miller's Circe
Mm-hmm.
is like a huge book. Like it's just very long, and it's a novel. And then The Vegetarian is also a novel, but it's like less than 200 pages. And so the word counts and the page counts of those books are super super different.
Right.
But with a short story, to get it to get them published in magazines, there's like pretty specific word requirements, as you know. So like short stories come in lengths of like 3,000 words, 5,000 words, 6,000 words, 8,000 words, and 10,000 words. And something about like having to work around a set word count is intimidating
Yeah.
because I would always find that my stories were like just slightly too long. And then it would come down to making these like tiny little decisions about like, ooh, can I cut like these transition phrases out of these sentences? And
Yeah.
it's like this isn't really writing anymore. This is like trying to arbitrarily like trim my story into some kind of like topiary so that it can be beheld by people who are going to reject it anyways. So what's even the point?
It's like accounting, you know. You got to balance your checkbooks. It's not a creative process by any means.
Yeah, and maybe that was a fault of my own process and not a fault of the short story as a medium. But it did leave me feeling sort of accountant like. I think that's a really good analogy and bored and frustrated because I was like, I'm not making these decisions because I want to. I'm making these decisions because I feel like it's a constraint of this medium that's been imposed on me by,
Yeah.
I don't know, faceless literocrats.
Literocrats. So that's the thing is like I'm so torn about that because I do admire things that are brief and to the point. So I understand in principle the necessity to do it, but I guess I'm just a blowhard. I you know I didn't swear off prose quite like Joshua did, but I'll read like Guy de Maupassant like short stories, and I'm like, how do you jam all of this in there? It's really interesting to me, and it's not fun, and it's definitely not fun to do within a semester with a bunch of strangers who might be writing smut while you're trying to like actually say something.
I know. I was trying in my story about Charlemagne. I was really trying to, and I failed. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm not like better than this lady, but I was really trying to say something about like what a tragedy it is that people can achieve these great things and they can come at a great cost. In the story, the real tragedy isn't that Charlemagne dies at the hands of the devil in order to get the cathedral that he commissioned built, which is ironic. The tragedy is that the Otto of Metz's boyfriend in the story is a huge admirer of Charlemagne, and so when Charlemagne dies, it destroys their relationship, and that's where the story ends. And so, like, these things come at a great cost, and then like we, external to the fiction, know that Otto of Metz doesn't even get credit for this thing. So I was trying to do something, right? And I did fail, but I was at least trying.
Hearing that synopsis makes me think of we both had a creative writing professor, and he was like, two architects in a city quietly going through a divorce isn't an interesting story, and all the Aachen stuff boils down to is there's an architect quietly going through a breakup.
I layered all this like spec stuff over it, but it is ultimately that is the contemporary lit short story. I mean, less so today than it was like maybe 15 or 20 years ago, but I think that like that problem persists in short stories broadly, where it's like the inciting incident of what would be a novel is the climax of a short story, and so like it ends right where it would begin. And oftentimes that's used to like a tragic effect because the lack of closure feels so painful. But also you read enough of them and they just start to feel the same.
Sure.
I'm foreshadowing unintentionally the reason that I left fiction. And I could talk about so after that failure, so as a reaction to my first story, I tried to go even more absurd. And I think it wasn't just a reaction to my own story, it was also a reaction to the stuff we were reading in that intro class. We are reading like some Joyce Carol Oates, some Sonny's Blues, some really like typical, very grounded stuff without much speculative element to it. And that was really frustrating to me as like a spec person who wasn't seeing fantasy or sci-fi elements represented in the literary world. And it is of course, because I mean that was a fault of my own reading. You know, I wasn't that widely read, and so I thought like, oh, I can be the one that like does fantasy and literature.
Yeah.
Which was so naive. So my second story was about it was from the point of view of a cat, and it was inside this extended daydream she was having where these figures that were like manifestations of her own insecurities were like tormenting her and taking her on a tour through this like candy land in a bus. And I think the English Club saw this one. I don't know if the English Club saw Otto of Metz, but it definitely saw this story.
I saw the cat short story, and remember, guys, about the Empress Teresa forums is I feel a lot more at liberty to criticize Joshua for this than some of those people should have to criticize Empress Teresa.
This story got ripped apart in the English Club and in my workshop, and Andrew, you can talk about why.
I'm so sorry, Joshua. It's not even I don't even know if I didn't like it. It was just like there would be, you know, I got the part about the cat's insecurities, daydreams, but like everything was described in like terms of candy, which was just so and Joshua gives me a hard time for using this word to this day, but it was just so saccharine, and I was just like, come on, dude, I know you're better than this.
It was really try hard, and it didn't help that so the first story we wrote was 5,000 words. This one had to be 3,000. So it was a trial of brevity. And there was really not enough room to introduce all the weird stuff I was trying to do. And it's funny because even to this day, somebody who's in my current graduate program was also in the English Club of that era, and she'll still talk about this story with fondness, and she's like, oh, you should go back and edit it and like fix stuff. I'm like, no, it's beyond saving. What are you talking about?
It's worth noting that the person Joshua is talking about is like the most kind and nice person I have ever met in my life. She's a saint.
Yeah, she's like a brilliant fiction writer, and she can find the good in anything, which was a really important role to be filled in the English Club, because we needed that person who no matter what the story was, would find something beautiful in it. I remember there was that middle grade writer that I mentioned. She turned in a piece of fiction that she admitted was adapted from How to Train Your Dragon fan fiction, and it was I mean, it was exactly what it says on the tin. There were like characters that had fantasy names, and then there was a guard named Greg.
Wait, yes. Greg the guard. I forgot all about Greg.
But our friend, the Southern Gothic writer whose kindness knows no bounds, she thought that like the bizarreness of a guy being named Greg in this fantasy world was like a really cool idea that could potentially be explored further. And so she was saying like, oh, you should have Greg be like a staple character who's like basically an isekai character. She wouldn't have used that terminology because I don't think she's ever seen an anime, but she was like, oh, what if Greg was from our world and he had been trapped in this fantasy world and found a job as a guard and like now he's the main character's friend and like, it was an idea. It was an idea that encouraged the writer to not disengage from the piece, and I thought that was a really great thing. But having that like mom friend in the group is so cool. Anyways.
So what was your vision with the cat story? I still wonder this to this day. This isn't even an interview question. Like, I just want to know, like, what were you trying to do? Describing, like, candy cane, cotton candy cloud, world, gum man.
Oh, yeah. So the characters were Travelogue, who represented Clem's desire to get out and see the world because she was a cat and she was trapped inside. And then the other one was the statistician, and that's like status with a U. It's like a pun. And like, his thing was like he measured her up against other people socially, so like he represented her insecurity comparing herself to other people and their abilities essentially, or other cats I should say, because her siblings were like minor characters. And so my goal was to be sort of contrarian and just be like, look at this crazy bizarre thing I can write, and it's like it's still fiction, just like all this like very grounded baseball story stuff. And the other thing was I was interested in like sort of psychological stuff like that.
Okay.
Which sort of foreshadowed my interest in Kafka. And so I wanted to write something that was happening like totally in somebody's headspace and like maybe was real, maybe wasn't real. I don't know. I thought it was interesting. And
that makes sense.
I also wanted to write something that was whimsical and fun because, like you said earlier, a lot of short stories do sort of devolve into this like, we're two sad adults and we have very stable jobs, but emotionally we're unfulfilled and that makes us sad. And isn't that the ultimate tragedy?
Truly.
And it's like, well, not really. So I was like, what if something is like just kind of fun and like, yeah, like she's mentally unstable, but like, in the end she gets over it and it's all fine. It was reactionary in a sense. It was a reaction against the stuff I was reading. And so I think that's partly why it wasn't a good story, is because it wasn't born of like a desire that I was coming up with out of myself. It was like, it was in response, which maybe that's not a bad thing in and of itself.
Maybe not. This makes me think, this isn't really so much of a question for you as much as it is I was thinking about the writing forums that Norman Boutin was on, and how when he got constructive criticism, he flew off the rails. Can you describe kind of the effect that the lukewarm reception to your cat story had on you?
Yeah, so like, I think a lukewarm response is honestly one of the worst responses you can get. The very worst response is to be told that you're doing something that's like in some way directly harmful to another person, like misrepresenting like a minority group or something. Mm-hmm. Like in my opinion, that's one of the worst things that can happen to you as a writer.
Oh, absolutely.
But one of probably the second worst is like this very ambivalent, like, it's fine, doesn't work for me kind of response from everybody in a room.
Yeah.
Because you've had no emotional impact. At least if somebody's angry about something you wrote, barring the case where they're angry because you did a really bad thing.
Right.
If they're just angry because they're angry and crazy, like at least it had an effect on them, the thing that you wrote. And that's ultimately what you want as a writer. Maybe you couldn't control that effect, but it did something.
You got attention.
You got attention. Isn't that what we all want in the end? We just want attention. So getting that lukewarm response was maybe the first wake-up call that fiction wasn't for me. I definitely didn't conceive of it like that at the time by any stretch. But it was sort of a sign that like I'm not doing what I want to do. The words that I'm putting down on the page are not affecting people. And I don't like that because I want to have an effect on people. That's what literature does.
Right. That's interesting. That's an interesting divergence because I've also experienced a lukewarm response back to the girl who ghosted me for the Alabaster thing. I was minimizing her opinions a little bit. A lot of the people in that class that I submitted that short story to didn't like it for a lot of the same reasons that your cat story kind of got a lukewarm response to. I had this vision in my head and I was going to prove people wrong. I was going to pioneer this new direction, and people are like, okay, well, I don't really get it, and it's not really for me, and I don't want to talk to you anymore because it's so weird. So I'm just gonna not talk about it. But I think that's an interesting divergence in you and I, because I never gave up well, I don't even want to say gave up, because that implies like some kind of negativity in you. I never took that as a sign that prose wasn't for me. I just kind of moved my approach in a different direction. So it's interesting to me how that was an indication for you that poetry was the way to go for you.
Yeah, I don't. Well, I like I said, I didn't think of it that way at the time, and I don't want to imply that like, oh, the English club killed my desire to write prose forever.
Sure,
But
sure, sure, sure.
but sort of like there were a couple pieces that continued to get ambivalent responses, many of them involving cats, curiously, that made me think like, this isn't doing what I want. I'm not doing what I want, and if
Mm-hmm.
I'm not doing what I want, then why bother doing it?
Right. Change it up.
I'm not gonna make money off of this English degree anyways, so I might as well be doing something that makes me happy.
You have a job, Joshua. Stop telling people that. Stop spreading misinformation.
That was my thought process though at the time, was I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
gonna
yeah,
make
yeah.
money out writing short stories. I should say writing short stories, not off of my English degree,
Ah, yeah, yeah, yes,
because
yes,
I'm
yes, yes.
undermining your premise of this episode by saying that.
Well, I'm not. You're not undermining the premise. You're just telling a lie. You are employed. I'm so sorry that you have to learn this from me,
Oh
but
God, I'm part of the corporatocracy. I'm part of the problem.
um,
Capitalism has subsumed me.
Jesus Christ. But I know that's not the end of the story with you, because when you came to English Club, you were submitting chapter by chapter. And this is something interesting to me. I want your opinion on this. Is this like a new development in the literary world, or is it just that we're getting older, that long form books aren't accepted in a critique group anymore? Because, so a small backstory about me is, in middle school I went to a writing camp, and when I applied, they accepted chapters of long novels. But now, when I look at the requirements, they don't accept chapters of novels anymore. I wonder if that's a new thing or not. And that's another reason that I started the English Club the way that it is now, is because I wanted people with longer form works to be able to share it with others. And you were the first person to take advantage of that. You had this long running YA novel that you submitted, and we kind of followed it through that entire year.
Yeah, so I'll speak to the like trends thing first. I guess at least to say that like I don't really know if that's like if the disallowing of chapters of longer works is like really a trend. Like I haven't done any like kind of data analysis on it or
Well,
anything.
sure.
But one thing I do see more and more is like chapters of books are allowed if they stand alone.
Mm,
So usually like a first chapter that like also kind of works as a short story will sometimes be permissible. And I know that like for MFA applications in fiction, that's kind of the only instance in which a lot of schools are looking for first chapters, and like contests are similar in that
yeah.
too. But I also think that like in the context of like a undergraduate introductory fiction workshop, they don't really want chapters for the reasons that I was saying earlier. Like they want you to be able to demonstrate that you can perform the basic techniques of fiction in a closed environment. It's so that like, because when you're in a workshop and like somebody submits a chapter, and people in the workshop are like, oh, I don't get why this person made this decision, or I don't get why this happened, the temptation for the person being workshopped is to be like, oh, well, that's explained in chapter 3.
Yeah. It's a good excuse.
It's excuse. And not only does like the workshop itself never see chapter 3 most of the time, I would say that like 99% of the time chapter 3 like never comes into actual material existence.
It doesn't.
um
Yeah, no one's ever written it.
Chapter
It
3
might
doesn't
be like an
exist.
outline in someone's notebook.
Yeah, there's like a bullet list somewhere in chapter 3 that's like, Marisa falls in love with Brad, and then Brad kills Jeffrey, and like that's it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not surprised that like that was like in high school, you said, right, that you did that camp thing. So I'm not surprised that like at that low of a level, and I don't mean to imply that like high schoolers are stupid or
Yeah,
anything. I
yeah,
just mean
yeah.
like at that like introductory of a level, they want you to be able to demonstrate techniques in a very confined and controlled way so that they
Hmm.
can see that you actually know how to do them and you're not leaning on like unwritten things as a crutch.
Right.
So I was the first person in the English club to take up this offer of submitting a novel chapter by chapter over the course of a year. and work through the entire fucking thing. And that's exactly what I did. We almost didn't make it, if I remember right, because something about like the way spring break fell that year made it so that we missed 2 club sessions. There was at one point there was like a 50-page chapter. Do you remember chapter 12 and chapter 12.5?
Yes. I remember you had to like really group them together in this really odd way. It worked out in the end because you made it, but still.
Yeah, I had fans at that point, so people didn't mind reading like 2 or 3 chapters in a week. But initially, it was literally like one chapter at a time. And I think people maybe didn't even believe that I was going to be able to like do it
No,
because,
I had no confidence in you whatsoever.
yeah. Well, it probably didn't help that. Okay, so the first thing I submitted to English Club was not the first chapter of A Feast of Lilies, which was the title of my YA fantasy book. It was a short story about like Satan, but if she was like a girl in like the Lake of Fire or
I
something.
forgot about that. Yeah.
I remember this story vividly because it lives dearly in my heart. I wrote it in high school during band practice. But anyway, it doesn't matter. So that same week of English Club, I believe, I teased the idea of my novel by having you project on the classroom projector art that I had
Yes.
commissioned of the characters in the novel that everyone was about to read. And so there's 4 principal characters. 2 of them are basically human. One's a fairy, but he's a
He's a
little
little
tiny
guy.
human.
Yeah.
The other 2 are lizard people, and so I had commissioned a anthro artist to draw the lizard people because I thought that they would be able to do it better, and I was right. And so you projected furry art up on the board of my
Lowest
characters,
point of my life.
but you actually did it. Like
I did
I
it. I
fully
did it.
emailed you these like really high quality
Yes.
furry art PNGs, and you were like, "Here I go. I guess everyone gets to see this now."
That's
Um,
exactly
and
what
they,
happened.
this artist, they did great work, but they had drawn there's a female one and a male one, and they had drawn the guy one like really buff, and he's wearing like an ancient Greek like robe because it's an ancient Greek setting. It was so horny
So
looking.
funny. It's
It
so
was
funny.
so funny, and everybody in the club was just like, I see.
But it ended up being a great book. Like I liked reading it over the course of the semester.
I was really appreciative of everyone's of efforts reading the whole thing. So yeah, like we said, we went through it chapter by chapter each week, and along the way, I was taking notes on each chapter and what everyone was saying, and taking into consideration all the different critiques I was getting.
Mm-hmm.
And I made it halfway through another round of edits of the entire book after that semester, and then I ultimately dropped the project because it was broken in like some really fundamental ways. It was a multiple point of view piece, because the piece had started as a NaNoWriMo project my senior year of high school. And I was reading at the time that, like, oh, the multiple point of view YA novel, that's in right now. And I was like, oh, I want to do that. It gets in. I'll be the guy who gets in because I'm doing the thing that's in.
Right.
Not realizing that, of course, like if it's in, everyone's doing it, because if it's recognized as in, then like it's already too late to be the trendsetter. So the novel followed like a human character, it followed like a fairy character, and it followed one of the lizard people. And the hardest thing for me to get right was like making the timeline make sense of like when the characters' plot lines converged. Because one thing that I wanted to do, having read a fair amount of YA novels with multiple points of view, was have a story. Like, it's pretty typical that like in those types of stories, the 3 or 2 or however many like main characters, like they get together at one point. There's like a
Yeah.
triumphant moment where like they finally unite, and now they're all friends and they're going to take down the bad guy. But I had this moment where the characters all get together at this big meeting where the bad guy has become enough of a threat that like a lot of people, not just the main characters, are gathered in one place, and they're trying to figure out like what the hell are we going to do about this guy. And the main characters are all there, and they hate each other, and so they all end up splitting off and continuing to go their own way. And I thought that was like a clever subversion of a trope, but like keeping the characters separate for the entire span of the book while also giving each of them enough screen time for their motivations to make sense, to say nothing of the minor characters who also played some really important roles, ended up being too much for me, and so I had to scrap the project.
So did that factor into the whole renouncement of prose altogether? Was that the last straw on the camel's back?
That was definitely not the last straw because we finished. That was the end of freshman year. That everybody finished reading A Feast of Lilies, and then over the summer was when I was doing a lot of those heavy edits, trying to make this fucking timeline make sense.
Right.
And then it just became sort of not really feasible to try to be writing this big YA novel while also writing short stories for my then intermediate fiction writing workshop class, which was a requirement of my major, the main requirement of my major, and thus required, the most amount of effort.
Sure.
Because I was trying to impress the people in my class, try to impress my professors, and be like a known entity in both the German and the English departments at St. Balasar University. And yeah, so I had to ditch the novel, and that led me to focus even more on my short stories, which that was definitely a factor in eventually leading me to quit writing short stories, ironically, was increased focus on them.
What was that like exposing, like, I guess, and essentially your baby to a bunch of strangers like that for a sustained amount of time? I know that might be a daunting thing for a lot of amateur writers who would want critique but might be scared of taking that first step.
I was honestly pretty proud of the book to begin with. So of course I was like nervous as anybody would be to share the first chapter, but I was really fortunate in that like people had read some of my writing already, and the response to it was pretty positive. So the first chapter was like by far the most polished and the most solid. So I wasn't too worried about submitting that one. It was some of the later ones that were pretty scary.
When it was like just new writing or more important parts of the story?
Both, but mainly the new writing thing. It was stuff that I hadn't had a chance to like really scrutinize yet, and it was places where I knew that the timeline was weaker, but more so the first thing. It was more new writing that I hadn't had the chance to really like make certain that I was satisfied for myself. That's always been a really important part of my writing process is I don't like to show people writing that I still know has problems that I can fix. If I know there's a problem and I know how to fix it, there's no point in submitting it to a workshop that's then going to tell me like, hey, this character's motivation doesn't make sense, because I'm just going to get annoyed because I already know that. I like to submit writing to workshops that's like, either I am so close to it that I can no longer see where the problems lie, which was the case for like a lot of A Feast of Lilies, or I know there's problems, but I don't know how to fix them, or I don't know what they are. People did hate it in a lot of the right places.
So you're looking back on the first year of college. How did you feel kind of having that first year down ready for the next stage?
Honestly, pretty insecure.
Really?
Yeah, because I wasn't really satisfied with the way that I had revised Otto of Metz or Clem in the Big World or my other third short story that I wrote for that class that we didn't and don't need to talk about. Um, I wasn't satisfied with them, and but I also didn't know how else to make them better. And so going into the next level of workshop, which I knew was going to be a little bit more competitive, a little bit
Mhm.
more serious, I was pretty nervous.
We will definitely talk about that more in a future episode of your deep dive into a creative writing major. But for right now, if there's anyone out there maybe about to go to college considering an English degree, or maybe someone who already has an English degree lined up that they're about to head into, what advice would you give them today?
If you're just starting college and you're thinking about pursuing an English degree, I would advise you at this stage not to think about it in terms of like what specific job you want to have after you graduate, because it can be a lot of things. And I think you'll drive yourself crazy as an incoming freshman trying to figure out like what actual occupation, job title am I going to be able to put on my name tag at conferences in 5 years? Like, you cannot know.
Mm-hmm.
But know that, like, if you feel called to do it, that's probably a good sign. If you're thinking of going into English because it seems easy, that's a bad sign. That's a really bad sign. Which maybe is common sense. I don't know. There were definitely some people that were in my degree that like seemed like they were there just because it was like, I don't know, I can skate by, I can sort of fake my papers or whatever and pass. And that's That's no good. It brings people down, especially in workshop. So maybe if you're already in English and you're questioning why you're in English, that's a time to try to state to yourself like explicitly what you're hoping to get out of it. But if you're just coming into college and you're thinking about getting into English, maybe ask yourself like if you feel a gut calling to write, and if you don't, then reconsider. But if you do and you can't express exactly why yet, that's probably okay. I don't know if that's good advice or not. That might be terrible advice.
Hey, but it worked for you.
It worked for me, but I also think the thing about like soft degrees like English, by soft I mean like there's not a clear career track or not like a set career track, is that like the thing that works for one person is likely not to work for another, because that's kind of the nature of them, is that they don't have a set track. And so trying to like say this is the track is like in defiance of the very thing that they are.
You have to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is the right thing for you.
Yeah, I mean, know why you're doing things, I guess. Uh, Good advice in writing, good advice in life. Don't be on autopilot. Act with intentionality. Reclaim agency over your own life and over your writing. Also, don't drive yourself crazy trying to choose every single word perfectly or have total control over everything that's happening in your writing or in your life, because you can't.
Right. Yeah, I mean, some things are just mid and they can be mid. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to prove something with every submission you make. Well, Joshua, I know after all this time, we're still right here before your sophomore year, so we are definitely going to come back and talk a little bit more about this, give people a little bit more of an insight into what it means to be a writer in a college setting, to study English, to study literature. So yeah, there's more to come. Joshua is in the middle of finals right now, talk about college. So he is still working on our next book for our mainline series, which is going to be Ready Player One by Ernest Cline.
Yeah, we're going to talk about his poetry some a little bit in that episode, I believe.
Yes, I'm going to make Joshua read that poem, and I'm going to record him saying it. I'm going to post it on the internet for everyone to see.
Oh God, no! I'm going to be canceled.
But yeah, so make sure that whatever platform you're listening to us right now, you're following on that. Just like, subscribe, share it with your friends. Right now, we are just receiving so many comments or subscriptions or likes. And I just want to let everyone who listens to this know that each and every one of them makes my day. I will just sit on my analytics app and I will watch these people talk. It just makes me happy beyond measure that so many people are getting involved with this project. So definitely stay tuned for more to come.
Follow us on our Twitter account. It's like at English Club Podcast or something. I don't actually know what our ad is.
SBU English Club Podcast.
SBU, whatever it is.
Joshua runs that Twitter. I have nothing to do with it.
Yeah, I run that Twitter. Try to keep it silly, try to keep it fun. If you, we've been meaning to say this for like a long time, but if you have any like questions for us, or I don't know, fan mail or whatever, like email us. What's our email again?
I think it's englishclubpodcast@gmail.com.
Yes, please email us your questions, your comments, your concerns, your hatred, your ire, your virulent rage, your deepest concerns, your passions, anything.
We want it all.
And maybe we'll answer any questions that you have on the podcast. I would love to start doing like a mailbag section or segment on the show. I think that'd be so fun.
Either way, guys, keep in touch and we will see you later around campus.
Yeah, don't be a stranger. You, Charlie. I know you're listening.
Charlie. All right, guys. See you next time.